The freshwater economists like Ed Prescott at the University of Minnesota and Finn Kidlin at Carnegie Mellon were joined by other academic economists working at universities predominantly located around the Great Lakes and constructed a theory of the business cycle which completely abandoned the Keynesian framework in favor of a view that was consistent with the conclusions of microeconomic theory. Markets worked, and government interference, contrary to Keynes, would only hurt the economy, not help it. It is impossible to separate the economics of these freshwater economists from the free market ideology that was the cornerstone of the conservative political movement which found its footing in the 1964 presidential campaign of Arizona Senator Barry Goldwater and culminated in the election of President Ronald Reagan in 1980. In much the same way that Keynesian economics found itself a perfect marriage with the presidency of Franklin Roosevelt, freshwater economists found in Ronald Reagan an opportunity to influence public policy in their direction. Real business cycle theory claimed that recessions were not the result of shocks to aggregate demand, as Keynes and those who followed him believed, but rather the results of shocks to aggregate supply. The counter-cyclical policies aimed at managing aggregate demand would be ineffective and in many cases harmful to economic recovery. The only way to help the economy, these economists said, was to try and boost aggregate supply. From this came the moniker of supply-side economics, which would be the intellectual backing of Reagan's economic programs. Legend has it that the economist Arthur Laffer was at a cocktail party with then Governor Ronald Reagan when he presented him a simple theory about taxes on a cocktail napkin. Laffer was explaining the relationship between tax revenue and the tax rate. Tax revenue is the total amount of money the government collects in taxes, but the tax rate is the percentage of people's income that is paid in taxes. Laffer pointed out the obvious. If the tax rate was 0%, that is, if the government took 0% of people's incomes, then the total revenue collected would also be 0. But then he applied a little economic theory. What if the tax rate was 100% and the government took 100% of your income in taxes? How much revenue would the government collect then? I don't know about you, but if the government took 100% of my income and I got $0 for all my efforts, I wouldn't work at all. The government would be collecting 100% of nothing. And so tax revenue would be $0 again, or at least something close to $0. This implies that there is an arc in between. As the government raises the tax rate from 0%, they will collect more and more revenue. But eventually, the disincentive effect that taxes have on working would overpower the rise in the tax rate. Higher taxes would actually mean revenue falls because more and more people choose to reduce the amount of work they do. This is most definitely a real thing. You can imagine a doctor with their own practice who can choose how much they want to work. As they take on more patients and earn more money, their marginal tax rate starts to rise, meaning they pay more and more taxes the more money they make. Eventually, the doctor has the option of taking another patient but paying 40 or 50% of that additional income in taxes, or calling it a day and heading home to enjoy some R&R. If the tax rate is very high, they might not feel it's worth it to actually take on the additional patient. Actually, prior to Reagan, it was more like 70% of that additional income went to taxes. High marginal tax rates reduce the supply of labor and slow the economy down. What is incredible about the Laffer curve is that it implies that the tax revenue collected here will be the same as the tax revenue collected here. But this spot corresponds to a relatively low tax rate, while this spot corresponds to a very high tax rate. Over the course of his presidency, Reagan cut the top marginal tax rate from 70% to 28%. Much to the chagrin of the supply-side economists like Laffer, though, the cuts were large enough that revenue did fall. After decades of Keynesian influence, the supply-siders embarked on a program of tax cuts, deregulation, and the promotion of free trade, all to promote better economic growth. And the results are mixed. The economy was good under Reagan, recovering from a recession in 1980 nicely, though the economists that still favored the Keynesian view noted that Reagan also increased government spending to its highest levels ever, boosting aggregate demand with record deficits. For better or worse, economists were now caught up in the ideological battles of our national politics, and few were willing to set aside their partisan blinders. But while the government's purse strings were in the hands of the freshwater economists, monetary policy and the Federal Reserve were under the influence of a group of saltwater economists who would come to call themselves the New Keynesians.